Okay. So we're going to now continue our lecture in covenant sexuality with our fourth point. Marital sex involves cultivated desire and active pursuit. Cultivated desire and active pursuit. We're naturally inclined to think of desire as something that erupts within us spontaneously and without our intentional direction. Okay, that's how we naturally think of it, as something that occurs to us. While desire certainly functions this way generally, there are aspects of otherness to our desire. There are aspects in which we don't have immediate control of them. Yet, we are given a more robust picture in Scripture. Mainly that desires can be cultivated. So I often use the metaphor of the light switch as a bad metaphor to describe how we control our desires. So maybe in your notes, put this heading. Do we determine or can we control our desires? Do we determine or can we control our desires? Now think carefully about this question for a second. You can see why someone would say no to that, because we all know what it's like to want things that we wish we didn't want. To desire things strongly and wish we could sort of flip a light switch off and turn that desire off so that we don't desire and long for those things anymore, right? Folks with same-sex attraction, which we're going to talk about in the next lecture, folks with same-sex attraction really do, many of them really do wish they could just shut that desire off. But you don't have to have same-sex attraction to be able to relate to this reality. Because we all know what it is to long for things that God has forbidden, to long for things that God wouldn't have for us. So the question is, where do those things come from, and what do we do with them? Do we have any determination over them? Well, if you believe the philosophy of Woody Allen, you know him, the eccentric filmmaker, right? If you believe the philosophy of Woody Allen, then you would say no, you don't. I don't know if you guys remember, this was, I think, decades ago now, but he used to be in a relationship that was not a marriage, but it was a permanent long-term relationship with another actress named Mia Farrow. She was a very beautiful woman. And they were in a relationship for a long time until scandal broke out. Because what had happened was the adopted daughter of Mia, she adopted a girl from, I forget where, but she adopted a girl who was who was quite a bit younger than her, obviously. She adopted a girl, and that girl had been raised in association with both Mia and Woody. And when she was around 22, this young girl, Woody Allen began a sexual relationship with her. Okay? And so even like secular media is asking the question, like, what the heck? What's going on here? How can you explain leaving this long-term relationship with someone roughly your age? I think at the time they were in their late 50s maybe, for a 22-year-old girl that was your adopted daughter in some respects. And his answer to that was the perfect summation of how our culture, I think, thinks about desires. And this is what he said. He said, the heart wants what it wants. There's no rhyme or reason to it. You meet someone, you fall in love, and that's that. But that first phrase, the heart wants what it wants, is a phrase that makes sense in our culture, and that should scare us. Because the presence of a desire is its own justification. The presence of a desire is seen to be something that verifies an experience. Who are we to challenge the experience of another's desire? It is by nature an unloving and intolerant thing to do. So applied to yourself, if you have this impulse and you fall head over heels for someone, even though you're in a committed relationship otherwise, why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you go for that? You're just living genuinely and living honestly with your desires. So I don't think any of us look to Woody Allen for our philosophy of life here. But you can at least appreciate where Woody Allen is coming from, in the sense that I'm sure that he never consciously decided to start to want to be attracted to her. I can believe that, right? But the fact of the matter is that it was the case. So he's saying, hey, the heart wants what it wants. There's no rhyme or reason to these things. So the only thing that we must do is follow them. But that's a very godless understanding of the heart and of desires. It's a very godless understanding. And frankly, it's a very narrow understanding of our psychology, of our anthropology, of the human experience. All over children's movies and theme songs for television shows is the theme, listen to your heart, obey your heart, hear your heart, and do what it directs you to do. And maybe I'm like really quirky, but I tell my kids, if you listen to your heart, it will lead you straight to hell. I'm like, well. But it's true. It's true. If you listen to your heart, you will think things are reasonable to do that God hates. Because your heart's sinful. Your heart needs redemption. So here's what I'm getting at. Back to our kind of our quandary, right? Can we control our desires? If by control we mean, can we immediately and consciously determine everything about our desires in a moment, I would say no. So we do not have immediate control of our desires. Let me see if oh good, it's up. So if we're talking about immediate control, I think all of us would conclude and agree that we don't have immediate control. Here's evidence for that. Think of the last time you were ticked off. Okay? I mean, think of the last time you were really angry. If someone came up and told you, stop being angry, would you be able to? In the moment. Or think of the last time you were just really crestfallen, or distressed, or sad, or fearful. And someone comes up and you says, stop being sad. Stop being fearful. Stop being depressed. Oh, thanks. I never thought of that. That was really helpful. I'm not depressed anymore. Okay? We don't have the capacities to have immediate and sort of unquestioning authority to direct our emotions in the moment necessarily. But here's what I want to say to you that's very important for marriage counseling. Just because we don't have immediate control doesn't mean that we don't have what I call eventual control. Okay? So we don't have immediate control, but we do have what I call eventual control. We do have eventual control. What I mean by that is we can determine the types of influences upon our emotions that will yield something that we find desirable and cut off the things that we find undesirable. Okay? There is a volitional direction that we can give to our desires. So, let me give you a metaphor to see if I can illustrate this. Like I was saying, the light switch, oh my word. I'm usually an okay drawer, honestly. But that didn't turn out well. I don't know. Maybe I'll do a side view of, no, I won't do a side view. I'm not even trying it. Pretend I drew a light switch there, okay? The light switch, okay? So I wish I had, well, there are some over here, but I don't trust myself to know how to use them at this point. With a light switch, when you want light in a room or you don't want light in a room, there is an immediacy to your decision to shut it off or to turn it on, okay? So it is with emotions, right? If there's an emotion that you don't want, flip, cut it off. If there's an emotion that you do want, go to the switch for that one, flip, turn it on. That is not how our emotions work. That is not what we mean when we say we have control over our desires or our emotions, okay? But just because we don't have immediate control doesn't mean we don't have eventual control. So the better metaphor for, I was going to try to draw it. The better metaphor than the light switch is building a fire, okay? Building a fire. Both metaphors have to do with the production of light, okay? Which is for the sake of our metaphor, the sake of our illustration, it produces light through our efforts, okay? With the light switch, it's immediate. With the fire, it's not immediate. When you walk into a dark room, if it doesn't have a light switch and you need to have light in that room, you have to build a fire. And what you do is you have to arrange an environment and provide certain conditions for fire to both be ignited and sustained. So what you're doing is you're arranging the conditions that will produce light. So you grab your log, you grab your kindling, you grab your newspaper. You arrange it in a way where there's going to be enough oxygen that's able to get there, and yet there's an enclosed enough place to capture some of the heat. So you're balancing heat, you're balancing availability of air, then you're striking a match and you're providing fuel for it. And once you've done that, you start to have light. It takes a lot longer to build a fire than to flip a light switch. So that's what it is like with the cultivation of right desire. You don't have immediate control, but you can arrange your life and arrange your heart in ways that will produce what you want. The other thing I like about this metaphor actually is when you flip a light switch, what's the nature of that light? Have you ever tried to read by the light of these fluorescent lights? It's really easy. It's consistent light. It's just on. So you're just reading and not even noticing anything. Have you ever read by the light of a fire? Or tried to read by the light of a fire? What's true of that light? It flickers. It's inconsistent. It's really bright at some times, and then at times it's less bright. So there's undulation there. It's a dynamic light. It's not a static light. And when you're reading by the light of the fire, it's inconsistent, and sometimes it gets lower, and so what do you need to do? You need to keep fueling it. And sometimes you need to just blow more air into it. Sometimes you need to close the flue a little bit to trap more of the heat. In other words, it takes effort to maintain. It is not automatic. So, let's apply this to marriage counseling. You will have many couples say, I just don't love him anymore. I just don't love her anymore. I don't have a lot of strong desire for her sexually or strong desire for him sexually. And I just can't make myself do it. How do I make myself attracted to my wife? How do I make myself attracted to him? How do I make myself want to be around them? And they assume because they can't flip a switch to make a desire turn on, to make them want to be around them, that means they'd have no control. But that's not a biblical anthropology. They do have eventual control. They are commanded to desire their spouse. We're commanded to desire our spouses in Scripture. So what that means is we have the means by which to arrange ourselves in that way. How can I say this confidently? Song of Solomon 7 verse 10. Song of Solomon 7:10 gives a very simple principle here, okay? it says, I am my beloved's and his desire is for me. It's a very simple coupling. Help me understand, think about for a second, the relationship between those two phrases. Okay? Is it a contrary relationship? I am my beloved's. In other words, I belong to him. I'm secure in the covenantal union that we have. I'm confident in our bond. I am my beloved's, but his desire is for me. That doesn't make sense, of course, right? So what's the relationship? One is the ground and one is the conclusion, I think, in my reading of this. The conclusion is, I am my beloved's. Upon what do I base that conclusion? His desire is for me. Okay? This is a very, very important principle in marriage. Okay? How does a spouse feel the belonging, the security of the covenant in a way, such a way that honors God and reinforces the commitment? How does your wife know that she belongs to you? Because your desire is for her. Okay? So what we have here is an illustration of the fact that marital sex has to involve cultivated desire. And how do we cultivate desire? So in the metaphor I gave you, what is the fuel? What is the kindling? What is the process of trapping heat and giving oxygen? What does it mean? What am I trying to illustrate when I'm saying arranging a fire? Well, in the simplest form, it's pursuit. Because you pursue what you desire, and vice versa is also true. You desire what you pursue. So I want this link to be very clear in your minds for your marriage counseling. Desire is cultivated by pursuit, and pursuit is enabled by desire. This is one of the major themes of the book of the Song of Songs, the Song of Solomon, which is a great book for marriage counseling in many ways, because it shows that strong desire leads to strong pursuit. Strong desire leads to strong pursuit, and strong pursuit enlivens strong desire. So I think it's worth at least a look. Turn there, open to Song of Solomon. Go to the opening chapter there, chapter 1. So from the very outset, she's expressing a desire to be pursued by this royal bridegroom. So this is like a play. Did you know this? There's like different actors that speak. Hopefully your Bible labels those actors between she, he, and then there's like a chorus of friends that they talk to. So let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your love is better than wine. Your anointing oils are fragrant. Your name is oil poured out. Therefore virgins love you. Draw me after you. Let us run. The king has brought me into his chambers. There is this openness and this longing to be pursued. Okay? And then he reciprocates. We could look at a lot of different things, but he reciprocates. Jump down to verse 8, where he says, if you don't know, O most beautiful among women, follow in the tracks of the flock and pasture your young goats beside the shepherd's tent. I compare you, my love, to a mare among Pharaoh's chariots. Your cheeks are lovely with ornaments, your neck with strings of jewels. There's pursuit here. And in these chapters, if you just flip through, in these chapters, this is where all those really awkward descriptions of the wife's body goes on, about her neck being a tower of David with shields on it, okay? Her teeth being like sheep shorn perfectly. That's kind of weird too. But the point is, he is looking at her and he is praising everything about her because he's expressing desire. That's what he's doing. He's expressing desire. Here's more evidence that desire and pursuit are put together in this book. Look at chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. On my bed by night I sought him. That's pursuit language. I sought him whom my soul loves. I sought him but found him not. I'll rise now and go about the city, in the streets and in the squares. I'll seek him whom my soul loves. I sought him but found him not. The watchmen said to me as they went about the city, have you seen him whom my soul loves? Scarcely had I passed them when I found him whom my soul loves. I held him and would not let him go until I brought him into my mother's house and into the chamber of her who conceived me. I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles or the does of the field, that you not stir up or awaken love until it pleases. This is very, very passionate language of a desire, an aching desire that results in a pursuit. If you want to, we won't read it, but chapter 5, verses 2 through 8 sort of gives a similar picture of this link between pursuit and desire. So here's something really important I need to point out. This applies to the conversation about covenant sexuality we're having, but it also applies generally for marriage, as really all these principles do. Please get this. The pursuit of the spouse, pursuit of your spouse, is not based on her desirability. The pursuit of the spouse is not based on her attractiveness or level of desirability, or his. So when I say desire and pursuit go together, I am not meaning to imply that there's something intrinsic in the other that is desirable, that if they just get enough of, or if they just arrange themselves in such ways, then suddenly you have a chance at the desire being inflamed within you. Because that's not what goes on in Song of Solomon, and it's not what goes on with the gospel. Okay? Let me show you, actually. Turn back to chapter 1 of Song of Solomon. I think there's something very instructive here. Look at verse 5, all right? I am very dark, says the woman. I'm very dark, but lovely, O daughters of Jerusalem, like the tents of Kedar, like the curtains of Solomon. Do not gaze at me because I am dark, because the sun has looked upon me. My mother's sons were angry with me. They made me keeper of the vineyards, but my own vineyard I have not kept. What on earth does that mean? Is she being a racist? She's saying, I have dark skin, and therefore I'm not as valuable, I'm worthless. That's not what she's saying. What's she saying? What's she acknowledging here? That's right. Typically, especially in the society of ancient Near East, right? Those who had darker skin were those who had to be outside. And those who have to be outside are typically not royalty. They are typically common workers in the field. So what she's acknowledging here is that there's a royal bridegroom that her soul loves. There's a prince that she loves. And she's acknowledging to this chorus of people that she's talking to, she's saying, don't look at me, don't judge me, because I'm a common laborer. I get sent out into the vineyards to work. My brothers make me work. But I can't keep my own vineyard, as a metaphor of, I don't get to be soft and light and pretty and always smelling good like the princesses who dwell under vestibules and in shade all day. In other words, I think there's a nod to the fact that she does not find herself worthy of the love of a royal prince. Okay? And in this way, it's a picture of Jesus' love for his bride. Because if Jesus loved his bride based on her attractiveness, we would all be dead meat. We'd be dead in our sins. There was nothing attractive in us that provoked Jesus' unique covenantal love towards us. You are not any better than the prostitute on the streets of Bangkok. You're not any better than the one who pimps that prostitute on the streets of Bangkok. In yourself, you're not. There was no reason Jesus had, in terms of your intrinsic beauty and value, to set his affections on you and not on somebody else. So, I think this carries over for what marital love is like. If we wait for our spouse to be an attractive person in order to pursue attraction to them, then our love is a very hollow and worldly love. Desire for one's spouse is not based on their attractiveness. It's based on your decision to pursue. Your commitment is a better way of saying it. Your commitment to pursue. And this commitment has to include sexual pursuit. It just has to. And I've counseled many men especially. I've counseled many men who just fall off pursuing their wives. And in fact, the tragedy of it is when they do pursue their wives and there is a sexual encounter between the two of them, they can't become aroused, they can't complete the transaction because their minds are so programmed to long for fantasy, to long for pornography, to long for other things. And they prove to themselves that the fires that they've been working so hard to build is not the good fire with the good light. It's an evil fire with an evil light. And so when they come to have good emotions and good desires, they have no ability to in that moment. And what they need to do is expose that, and they need to tear apart the one and build the other. And it's a process. It's a very long process at times. Sometimes it's not super long, actually. I mean, we don't want to act like it's a forever process necessarily. But it's a process. It's not a light switch. It's not immediate. It's eventual, and it takes consistent pursuit. And sometimes you fail, but you keep going. And a wife must be pursued. So when Solomon talks about this girl's hair and teeth and cheeks and navel and breasts and everything like that, I don't think what we want to read into this is that this is the girl with the ultimate perfected body, okay? And in heaven, every girl's going to look like this. I don't think that's how we want to read that. I think we want to read it as a testimony to the high value that Solomon, the bridegroom, has for his bride. Similar to when we hear about Jesus cleansing us so that we are without spot and wrinkle, to be presented in the splendor and the beauty of holiness. Jesus values you as his child. He values his church. Do you realize that? He looks at you and he looks at his church with all its ugly suspicions and cliques and failures and apathy and whatever else. He looks at his church with all of that, and he loves her and finds her to be eternally valuable to him. And one day he'll present the church to him as perfected in her beauty. That's like the love of a husband to his wife and I think in this case a wife to her husband. So, what I'm getting at is that sexual desire needs to consistently be cultivated. It is not automatic. All right, next point. Point 5 there. Marital sex is regular and consistent, which provides spiritual protection. Marital sex is regular and consistent, which provides spiritual protection. There's a prophylactic function to sex. That just means it blocks, it protects, it goes before in order to prevent certain things from happening. And 2 main passages come to mind on this. Turn to Proverbs chapter 5. Proverbs chapter 5. Start in verse 15. Drink water from your own cistern, flowing water from your own well. Should your springs be scattered abroad? Let them be for yourself alone and not for strangers with you. Let your fountain be blessed and rejoice in the wife of your youth. A lovely deer, a graceful doe. Let her breasts fill you at all times with delight. Be intoxicated always with her love. Why should you be intoxicated, my son, with a forbidden woman, and embrace the bosom of an adulteress? For a man's ways are before the eyes of the Lord, and he ponders all his paths. The iniquities of the wicked ensnare him, and he is held fast in the cords of his sin. He dies for lack of discipline, and because of his great folly, he's led astray. Okay, the main metaphor here is the metaphor of an independent water source, a spring. Now, we don't think about this often because in our culture, we turn on a faucet and there comes water, unless you're living in the city of Detroit right now and they've shut it all down. Those poor people. But the point is, you don't think about water sources. When you choose the apartment or the house that you're going to buy and live in, you're not looking for a water source on the property because it's all provided for you. But in the ancient Near East, water sources were few and far between. Towns were built around them, right? You can only live within walking distance of regular water. You need water to live. So, this is talking about the fact that if you are lucky enough to have an independent water source on your property, you are a fool if you open it up for the trampling and the use of everyone to drink it dry, to corrupt it, to misuse it. You protect that as a treasure, as an inheritance that you'll pass down to your sons and daughters and their sons and daughters. It's extremely precious. It's extremely valuable. That's the metaphor given here. It's a metaphor for your sexuality. It's a metaphor for your peace of mind, your purity, the purity of your inheritance as a possessor of your own sexuality. And what he's saying is, look, use your cistern for yourself. Preserve it. Guard it. Why would you scatter it abroad? Streams of water in the streets, okay? The idea is here, that's just wasted water. It's running down the gutter. That's precious stuff. Let it be, look at verse 17, all of the emphasis. Let it be for yourself alone, not for strangers with you, not for others. Let your fountain be blessed. And then he tells you what metaphor he's giving. Rejoice in the wife of your youth. A lovely deer, a graceful doe. Let her breasts fill you at all times with delight. Be intoxicated always with her love. This is the verse that teenage boys laugh at, okay? But think of the function here. Think of the logic here. It's saying, be satisfied with the body of your wife. be intoxicated and delighted with her sexual attentions towards you. So what we have here, I think fundamentally, he's not saying that the wife's body or the quality of that body or the amount of her sexual attention is what keeps you from spilling the water out in the streets and wasting your inheritance. That's not what he's saying. But what he is saying is that's an aspect of a heart that is seeking purity is going to find satisfaction, regular use of the delights of sexuality in marriage. Because the contrast here is in verse 20 there. Don't be intoxicated with an adulterer. Don't embrace her bosom. Embrace the bosom of the wife of your youth. So it's not saying sexual delight's wrong or try to have so much self-control that there's no sexual delight. For a married man, it says, no. Use your delight. Use your sexuality with your wife and don't be a fool and think that you should use it with an adulterer. This always leads to death. And of course, he's making a very, as we've said, theocentric point, because verse 21, right? Yes, this has to do with your wife, but it has to do more with God. For a man's ways are before the Lord, and he considers or ponders all his paths. The iniquities of the wicked ensnare him, and he's held fast in the cords of his sin. You know what this teaches us? Our society thinks that sexual freedom is the ability to couple with whomever or whatever with whatever frequency we want. That's what they think of as freedom. But the Bible gives the exact opposite picture. It says that's actually cords, that's ropes, that's shackles. It's a snare, it's a trap. And you know what? You don't need much more proof. There's empirical proof that this is a trap. Look at how possessed we are as a culture and all of the sexual addictions and all, even if somebody's not sort of addicted sexually, the average unbeliever who's given over to the indulgences of their sexuality, they're not happy. They're not free. Guys, the quiet joy of having a pure marriage bed where you don't have to worry about the inclusion of others, where you know that what occurs there, the pleasure that you experience is pleasing to God and is in fact worshipful to Him. This is a joy and a pleasure that it can't be touched. It can't be manufactured. It can't be measured. That's what he's saying here. So there's a protective function to sexuality. That's a good thing. 1 Corinthians 7 makes the same point. If you want to write that down, it just says, do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again. Why? What's his purpose clause? So that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Paul himself says, the ground of my command for you to regularly have sex with one another as a married man and a married woman is so Satan doesn't come and tempt you because of your lack of self-control. So we readily acknowledge that sex has a protective function. So the term deprived here is connected with the concept of verse 3 to conjugal rights. So he's saying, don't deprive one another of sex. And the only proper time to suspend regular sexual activity is to devote yourselves to prayer. Okay? So did I say this earlier? In that time, right, you're living a lot of slave labor, you're living a lot of tough, difficult lives. They don't have like leisure time all the time. So the limited time they would have to be together, there are times and seasons where they said, let's pray, let's use this time to seek the Lord. And the purpose of coming back together is clear so that they're not exposed to Satan's attack. So one way to fight the devil in your marriage is to have good sex, is to have regular sex. is to be engaged with one another. That's one good way to oppose Satan's devices. Now, let me say a word of nuance on this point before I move on to our next. A lot of times, I know, especially wives who have had husbands who are unfaithful or look at pornography, which is unfaithfulness. A lot of times they hear a point like this and they think, oh no, I didn't give it to him regularly enough, and thus the protective element was not over him. So his sin is in some way my fault. That's not the case. Guys, ladies, and you need to tell ladies this, if you are a quadriplegic who is completely unable to fulfill your husband sexually, guess what? The Spirit of God can help him to remain pure all the days of his life. Okay? So when a man stumbles into pornography, it is not because his wife didn't give it to him enough. It is because his heart was restless for things that were not God. That's why. So I just want to say that as a point of nuance. Okay, so one last point, point 6. Marital sex involves creation. You could say procreation. A husband and wife utilize sex to participate in their calling as human beings, to have dominion over the world. Fruitfulness and multiplicity are always seen in Scripture as the positive outworking of the image of God. And as we've established, the image of God involves this covenantal sexual union of differing beings. So, in other words, when there's sexual union, children are created. Okay? Children are created. And children being created from marital sexual union is seen as an incredible blessing in the Bible. It's one of the most regular and consistent signs of blessing in the Bible. Genesis 2:28 says, "Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it." This is a clear reference to sexual procreation. Fruitfulness and the womb are often associated throughout the Old Testament. Psalm 127, 3-5. Of course, you're familiar with this. "Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the children of one's youth. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them. He shall not be put to shame when he speaks with his enemies in the gate." So here's our key principle for this point. A primary purpose of covenant sexuality is the bearing of children. Here's more. Individual couples may not elect to ignore this purpose in their sexual relationship. Individual couples may not elect to ignore this purpose in their own sexual relationship. Here's one more really important point I want you to get. This, however, does not indicate that God's will for every couple is to have as many children as sexually possible. This, however, does not indicate that God's will for every couple is to have as many children as is sexually possible. So have you had the debates with your friends, or have you thought through the issue yourself of birth control, of family planning, of should I ever use protection to prevent pregnancy in the context of marriage? Should I should I have as many children as will come? Okay? And the issue, the theological and philosophical issue behind that question is the question of compatibility. Remember we talked about this in our opening day? Concurrence, providential concurrence, meaning what's the tension between divine sovereignty, God chooses, God makes things happen, and human responsibility? Okay? And if we have a compatibilist understanding, this is my opinion, we can interact about this, okay? This is an area we have to tread lightly, all right, and not say, thus saith the Lord, too quickly. But God's will and human will are not necessarily opposing forces, is an important point to make. God's will and human will are not necessarily opposing forces, but rather they overlap in the execution of God's eternal plan. We were making this point about how two people become married, right? If two people are married, then it is true that it is within the divine, foreordained plan of God that they would be married. But, nevertheless, we recognize that they made conscious, direct decisions out of their own nature and their own will to prefer to marry her rather than her, or him rather than him. So, it's not that God's determination is threatened by the exercise of humans making decisions out of their nature. So it's not either we decide or God decides. That's a false binary. Either we decide or God decides. So, in other words, if a couple makes a decision regarding children, it doesn't mean they're taking matters into their own hands and out of God's hands. Okay? So we want to make that clear at least. So having said that, one has to be very careful with the motives and the reasons for which the decisions are made. Okay? Why are you choosing to delay children for a season? Why are you choosing to have children right away? Why are you choosing to space your children out 1 year as opposed to 2 years or 3 years or 5 years? What makes you determine when you're done having children? Do you determine if you're done having children? These are the types of questions that you ask and you press and you think hard about your own motives regarding, and you seek the face of God, knowing that, yes, your will is involved because we live in a society that has the technological means of having more determination of whether a child is produced from a union or not. But even with those means, guys, in the end, God's the one who decides. So let me give you just, at least in terms of making this decision and walking people through this decision, we at least need to be clear that there's a spectrum of depleting sexuality of its procreative function. Okay? It's a privilege, and we should never empty it of its function in a cavalier manner or in a way that hasn't fulfilled its design. So here's the spectrum of depleting sexuality of its procreative function. Okay? On the sort of most extreme end, there's a permanent state that you have emptied sexuality of its procreative function. So this is the various types of surgery you would have to prevent pregnancy. For females, it's tying tubes and other such things. For men, it's vasectomies and other things like that. So what you're doing there is you're bringing about an irreversible condition of neutralization. Okay? Now, technically it's reversible, but in some situations it's just crazy expensive, okay? But for all intents and purposes, it's a permanent state of neutralization, okay? Then you have, in the middle, there are temporary states of neutralization. So bringing about a reversible condition of neutralization. A reversible condition like the pill, hormone therapy. I'm not talking about abortifacient. I'm not talking about the morning after pill. I'm talking about hormones, hormone therapy, okay? That's a temporary state in which you've made your body unable to produce the things necessary to birth a child or to conceive a child. So permanent state, temporary state, and then there's individual occasion on this side of things. Individual occasion. Meaning you're preventing a single act of sex from being procreative. You're neutralizing yourself for a single act of sex. Examples here would be, condoms, would be the pull-out method, would be the rhythm method, things like that, okay? So you're just ensuring that an individual sexual encounter between husband and wife, will hopefully not create a child. So as you help people think that through, help them think through the levels of permanence that they're going to. And I would suggest that the level of permanence increases the weight and the stakes of the question, okay? It increases the weight and the stakes of the question. And I'll take questions in a second here. But when I say testing the motives, I want us to have a very clear understanding of how our motives are shaped by the cultural expectations around us. There's a reason why there are trends in family size according to a culture. Did some of your grandparents come from big families? Anybody in here? A lot of people. How big? Anybody? 13 children. That's amazing. How many? 10. That is so very rare in our day. 10 or 13 children. That's looked upon as freaky, honestly. And I wonder if a lot of it has to do with our personal expectations of the standard with which we should be living, right? So those 13 children, I don't know your grandparents' family, but I guarantee they weren't miserable simply because they were part of a 15-member family. There's a lot of fun there. I'm one of 6 kids myself, and 6 kids wouldn't have been a big family a few generations ago, right? So all I'm trying to say is sometimes when we say things like, I don't want to have children because I can't afford them, just keep in mind that your definition of what you mean by afford is probably not, number one, it's very influenced by your culture. Number two, it probably doesn't fit into the biblical conception of what it means for God to provide. If you wait until you can afford children to have children, you will never have children, okay? As I've said before. Nevertheless, I do think there are legitimate concerns regarding health, regarding mission, kingdom-oriented mission, that do influence decisions to perhaps have fewer kids than you otherwise would if you left everything completely natural. I do think there are reasons for that. I've spoken to many couples who reticently decide to put a permanent state of neutralization on one of them because the condition of their wife's body, or in one case, the husband's body, was just so poor. And they had to think carefully about, okay, if our mission is to love and to care and to raise carefully the children that we have and to be available to go where God is calling us to go, then we have to maintain margins. And we think it's a wise decision on our behalf to make measures that make it less likely for us to have another child in view of the call of the kingdom on our lives, right? That's a very different motivation than I can't afford it, which what we actually mean by is I can't afford it and also be able to have my hobbies or drive the cars that I want, right?